I'm going to give the first bit of this talk, which is some kind of general background to the topic, and then Cristina will give you the nitty-gritty of the work we're doing now. So obviously this topic is looking at origins of agriculture, in a way, in Ethiopia. Now Ethiopia is interesting. If we go back to early work on the origins of agriculture and centers of origin, work by, for example, the Soviet botanist Nikolai Vavilov, who drew the first maps of centers of domestication. Ethiopia was the only part of Africa that made it onto his map. So it's been recognized for a very long time as having a very high biodiversity of crops, both high genetic varietal diversity within crops known elsewhere, things like barley and tetraploid wheats and sorghum, but also a lot of endemic crops that are grown in Ethiopia and almost nowhere else. If we look at a more modern view of Africa, it's one of probably 5 or at least 5 major centers of domestication, and it has, as you can see, a lot of crops. Most of them are not very well known in other parts of the world, although finger millet is an exception on that list there. It's also of interest in that it is one of the southernmost extents of the dispersal of crops of Near Eastern origin. These are things like wheat and barley. So the kind of southern limits of wheat and barley go down to the southern Ethiopian plateau. That's at like latitude of 11 or something like that. So quite far south into the tropics. But of course, because it's at high elevation, it maintains kind of Mediterranean type climate. And so you also get things like wild olives in the mountains down there and lots of other things you might recognize from Mediterranean environments. The red line on this map shows the approximate traditional limits of the ARD, so plow agriculture. So it's also a southern extension of that form of agriculture. Most of sub-Saharan Africa uses hand tools only rather than cattle traction. The highlands are very well watered, so they have 2 rainy seasons. The Karamet, which is the kind of monsoon, which comes off the Indian Ocean, so you get higher rainfall at higher elevations generally, focused on the summer, but you also get a winter rainy season, the Beld, which is actually higher towards the south and the east, and very high rainfall levels. So it makes it potentially very productive for agriculture. Now, we often, people talk about the Ethiopian plateau, the Ethiopian highlands as a center of domestication, but it's really 2 different agricultural zones that are really quite distinct in some ways, although of course they overlap. In the north, you have a focus on cereals and grain agriculture. This is the area where the Ethiopian grain teff is predominant. We also have a lot of cultivation of wheat, sorghum, finger millet, barley, etc. And in the south, the bit in blue here on Simoon's map from the 1960s is really a vegecultural center. So yams, aroids, including introduced Asian species, the so-called gala potato, which is a kind of mint that produces a tuber, now being kind of displaced by potatoes from South America, and as we'll talk about today, enset. So we have these kind of 2 areas. In broad terms, you can think of them as divided by the Nile. So this is the Blue Nile coming up here, and then it curves north to Lake Tana, and south of that where the Nile runs east-west, south of that is mostly vegecultural, north of that is more cereal-like, and that's been recognized for a long time. So there's Murdoch's map of the enset and teff zones that he mapped in the 1960s. So I'm just going to give a little bit more sense of these 2 different zones and some of their crops and some of their variables. What this cross-section is meant to show is the kind of enset zone. So we'll come on to this crop enset in a little bit. Where it's most productive and most heavily reliant on is above sort of 1,700 meters. So that's the bit in dark green there. But it's cultivated down to almost 1,000 meters. One of the things to note is that the wild enset occurs at these lower elevations, so 1,000 to 1,500 meters, and the cultivation of it is mostly above 1,500 meters. So part of that domestication process also involves an upward translocation. So there's some interesting questions there about what that does to a crop. But what this shows is the kind of elevational ranges of some of the major grain crops. So things like sorghum and finger millet are kind of lower elevation, and then teff actually has a quite narrow range at around kind of 2,000 meters the other side. And then wheat and barley, it shows quite high elevations because again, those are the lower elevations that's kind of too hot and tropical arid to support those. So they do other higher elevations. Yeah, so some of your northern cereal zone, this kind of shows them on a map and roughly on this kind of north-south. This is a kind of north-south axis along the Rift Valley, showing where some of the lakes are. So yeah, sorghum, barley, teff, those are the southern things, often associated with ard tillage, annual agricultural cycles, things that we'd be much more familiar with in a Mediterranean type of agricultural system. And then the south is really vegecultural, so lots of things cultivated for tubers, different kinds of yams, both native to Africa and introduced. That's the gala potato, so-called Tranthus edulis, which is in the mint family, and this is enset, which we'll hear more about, which is related to the banana. So it's sometimes called the Ethiopian false banana. It's harvested at different ages depending on elevation. I think Cristina will talk more about that, but you could think of it as roughly being harvested when it's 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old. So it's all these things have a much longer agricultural cycle than the cereals we're used to. It's not the case that they don't grow cereals. They also grow emmer wheat and barley and sorghum, but they're kind of secondary kind of staples alongside the viticultural ones. It's been referred to as the tree against hunger, but because a typical household has groves of enset at different ages, if you're running out of your cereal stores, you can always go and harvest another enset tree, and when it's stored, it has to be fermented for a while, but anyways, it can feed quite a large, your household for quite a number of days or quite a large number of people. So it is also true that the southern part of Ethiopia tends to not suffer from famine, so those famines in the 1980s, which were quite famous, that's northern Ethiopia and eastern Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. It wasn't the enset growing people who suffered from those. They have much higher food security. So there's an interest in that from a kind of food security point of view. But despite that, it's actually in decline historically over recent time at the expense of the spread of cereal cultivation and plow agriculture and kind of, modern NGOs promoting wheat and maize rather than traditional crops. And so that's one of the reasons that our colleagues at Kew have been interested in this project, is to try to think about preserving and conserving and promoting the diversity of this crop. This map shows the distribution of domesticated or wild insects. Some of these, the kind of lighter purple dots, are historical cultivations. So these are ones that are mapped in Stieler, who's a kind of German geographer in the 40s, and Frederick Samoons, who worked in the 50s in northern Ethiopia. So these northern dots are mostly places where you won't find insect cultivated today, but where it's recorded in sort of 100 years ago. Yeah, and then the green are wild populations. So, and then the purple bits are what are considered the kind of where it's really a staple food, the kind of core areas. The kind of bluer purple is just where we have whole genomes at the moment from our Kew collaborators, and the darker green is also whole genomes. Also, an interesting thing from a geographical point of view is where enset sits in relation to the ethno-linguistic diversity of the Ethiopian highlands. So it sits down there in the south, where you can see lots of linguistic diversity. These are the languages either classified in the East Cushitic branch, which is part of the wider Afroasiatic tree, or the Umatic languages, which are the kind of, maybe the basalmost branch of Afroasiatic, and are not very well understood, but there's very high diversity here, and that's that's a kind of substrate that underlies the kind of spread of what are called the Ethio-Semitic languages, which are these ones up here, but in gray here, which are generally thought to be a later dispersal. They're the kind of sister language group to the South Semitic languages in Yemen and so forth. And you can see the kind of islands of Cushitic that are kind of the older languages that still persist in the north. One of the reasons that's interesting is if you think about kind of ideas about language diversity and language dispersal in agriculture. Southern Ethiopia fits the pattern of, say, the New Guinea highlands, so kind of New Guinea highland agriculturalists, or hunter-gatherer type systems with high ethno-linguistic diversity in small territories and lots of interaction, as opposed to the idea of a kind of expanding agricultural frontier wave. So this diagram, I think, has been really popularized in papers by Colin Renfrew and books by Colin Renfrew, but I think it originates in this Valuable article. So this is their kind of ideal of the farmers spreading with language, as opposed to these kind of tropical horticulturists. So this area clearly kind of fits this kind of pattern of lots of ancient and established diversity of agricultural systems that don't really necessarily go anywhere. This is a map from Samoon's writing in the 60s showing this notion of the southern limits of the plow, or really the ard here, and the notion that it's spread into this area, and then where you have these gray areas are where he mapped inset, major inset cultivation, including areas in the north where it's now no longer an important crop, where it's kind of disappeared, including over here. Okay, so where does inset cultivation come from? There's a lot of crazy ideas out there if you go into the literature. James Bruce, who was a Scottish-British explorer in the late 1700s, said, oh, it must, because it's an important crop, it must come from Egypt. I think that's just because things came from Egypt in his mind. But anyways, Vivi Lauren Tackholm, who was a botanist who wrote the flora of Egypt in the first half of the 20th century, she also decided it must come from Egypt, so she wrote a paper on it, which I would say is a little bit nuts. She interpreted this motif on Nakata pottery as inset, even though it doesn't grow at these elevations today, even though there's no archaeological evidence. She said, oh, well, we're going to find it later. So, okay, let's throw that out as a little bit nuts. Steve Branch, who's an archaeologist who's worked a lot in various parts of the Horn of Africa and works in the Southwest Highlands today. Obviously, it comes from the Southwest Highlands. He kind of speculatively said it's because of the high diversity of it there, because of the high ethno-linguistic diversity, it might be very ancient, and the southern southwestern Ethiopia should be a refugium during the LGM. So he suggested it could be cultivated even in the late Pleistocene, although he didn't have archaeological evidence for that. So those are the kind of, I suppose, extreme ends. So it's either an LGM domestication in the southern highlands, or it comes from Egypt. We do think it comes from the southwestern highlands, but we really don't know when. Other people have speculated looking at the kind of ethno-linguistic diversity. So Roger Blench, for example, in his book on African languages and archaeology says it's first cultivated amongst Umatic and the ancestors of East Cushitic groups. That seems reasonable. Those are the languages spoken there, and there's a high diversity there, and that would have therefore been taken place before the spread of East Cushitic languages northwards, or some of the East Cushitic groups northwards. He also points out that there's no shared vocabulary across these groups, suggesting that these groups are diversified as hunter-gatherers before they inset is domesticated, or they're domesticated more than once. The northwards movement of Cushitic later he associates with the expansion of livestock in the Ethiopian plateau, but archaeological work in recent years suggests that livestock are relatively young in the plateau. So dates are 2,000 years ago, 2,400 BP, so relatively late. So if that's the case, then we need to clearly look for an earlier expansion of inset. It does look like the spread of plows and cereals has been pushing inset south, and even in recent times we've had the disappearance of cultivation in places where it's recorded in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And that tends to be, that dispersal southwards tends to be associated with Ethio-Semitic groups and their kind of ard systems and so forth. And so again, that kind of if we know when that happens, then we can say, well, inset is domesticated before that. Archaeological evidence from the north, which I'll show in a minute, wheat and barley and so forth seem to go back to kind of 3,000, 3,500 BP, so maybe 1,500 BC for the part of that expansion, so that puts inset earlier than that. The linguist Eric has kind of said, oh, this must happen before 5,000 BP, but again, there's no archaeological evidence to support that. He also has the Afro-Asiatic Attic languages coming, I think, from the north to the south rather than the other way. So anyways, never mind. So where the state of archaeobotanical evidence in Ethiopia is very limited. So this map shows existing sites. There's some in Eritrea. There's some in the north around Aksum. Mesber is an important assemblage recently worked on by Kathy D'Andrea, the Canadian project. There's a little bit around Lake Tana, and then there's a little bit down here, which we'll talk about in a minute. So it's very, very limited. But these sites up here tend to be, in their earliest levels, immer wheat and barley and lentil, going back to 1000 BC, 1500 BC. The earliest African crops in these northern sites are at the end of the first millennium BC. So there's kind of wheat and barley first, African cereals later. And down here we also get wheat and barley at least about 2,000 years ago. This is the spread of livestock. So livestock are quite early in Africa without cereals, places like the Khartoum region and the kind of Kassala region, where the spread of, well here it's like 5,000 BC, and even at Lake Turkana 3,000 BC. So there's a sense that livestock spread in the lowland areas around the highlands quite early, but dates in the highlands that you can see are all quite young. So up to like kind of maybe 2800 BP, but sites down here, 300 BC, something like that. So, and some of these sites have earlier strata with fauna identified and no sheep, no goat, no cattle. So livestock do seem to be late in the highlands. Okay, this zooms in on that inset zone. We will talk about the Gammo Highlands, so this is the Gammo Highlands here. The other sites in this area that have sequences are Latina Borrego, mostly being worked on for its Pleistocene material to look at modern humans and the dispersal out of Africa by Steve Brandt. But the upper levels do have some archaeobotanical evidence of various fruits and some unidentified parenchyma remains, tuber remains, so fruits and tubers, and those are from levels that date back to the early centuries AD. Kamali apparently has good archaeobotanical preservation, but it was never properly studied, and that material is hidden away in a box somewhere in Ethiopia. But it had coffee, apparently, coffee seeds and leaves that are probably inset from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD. 200 AD would be a kind of medium. And then we're going to look at the Gammo sites. There's barley possibly at 200 BC. It's a question mark because the AMS date failed on that. I mean, it was destroyed in pre-treatment, and most of the material is later than that. And other crop assemblages started about 600 years ago. Okay, so this is the area where this ties into some archaeology that we've done or that I've been involved in. So here's these 4 sites in the Gammo Highlands where I did some work in 2011 and 2012 with John and Kathy Arthur from the University of Southern Florida, who were running a project both archaeological and archaeological. And the cave data was published a couple of years ago. So there's 2 cave sites and 2 open air sites. So I'll briefly introduce you to those because these will be linchpins in our project moving forward, we hope. So we have 2 open air sites which are, let's say, historic. These are the ethno-historic sites, so they're in the ethnographic traditions as sites where this is where the first Gammo king lived, according to ethnohistory. And the ANS dates run from about 1500 to 1800. And Gereshongole is a low status site of an overlapping period. You can see the ANS dates there. So these were excavated in 2011, 2012 with sampling for phytoliths that I carried out and flotation. And then in the same years we had smaller excavations at a couple of cave sites. The hope was to get much earlier material, but most of those levels are, again, a few hundred years earlier. Tawate Mota Cave has some earlier levels that go back to, in fact, go back to something like 2000 BC, but 2400 BP, so 400 BC is when we get the first ceramics, and we have 1 barley grain, which is destroyed in ANS data. And in those levels, it goes to about 600 AD when it's abandoned. So that's those. The caves are down in these, on the hillsides, and often the sites are quite distant from roads. So initially trying to convince our colleagues that we wanted to take 40 liters per layer and for every square, every layer, and float all of it. Took some convincing because people didn't really like carrying them up the hill for a half an hour. But I found that the local villagers were very happy to rent us a donkey to carry things. So this is in 2012, we basically moved everything by donkey. Great way to move flotation samples. And we took them to the water because, up in the highlands there are some little lakes, so this was flotation one day in one of those, 2012, I guess. We've done work on the macro remains, not all of which is published yet. We have the usual suspects, I would say, for the grains: Immer wheat, lots of barley, lots of sorghum, cotton, so interesting, so craft production. The high status site, so the Gammo King site, actually has a lot of date stones, which is interesting because the date palm won't grow anywhere near here. So those are clearly imported, and some other fruits and meaty things. There's also a fair amount of charred parenchyma, so stuff from tubers, not identified. So this shows at the low status site, Gereshongole, the kind of ubiquity of charred parenchyma in the different, these are different trenches, so different units. And then a lot of charred processed food material. So porridgey, bready, charred foods, all which needs to be worked on, also very high ubiquity. And this just shows a processed food, which is kind of batter-like. We don't really know how to interpret some of this stuff yet from this part of the world, with some fragments in it that look like tuber fragments, so processed tubers that are in something. And this is another processed food of a different kind of matrix texture with bits of vascular tissue. So it's clear that we have a lot of work to be done at the SEM on these charred food and parenchyma material, and part of this project will build up better reference material for that. So to summarize from these sites, we have, in the last 600 years, from all the sites, all the 2 cave sites and the 2 open air sites, we have evidence for wheat, barley, sorghum. 1 of the cave sites also has finger millet. 3 of the sites have cotton, and all those sites have livestock. Then there's a gap, and we only have 1 site that goes back to 2,000 years ago. The earliest pottery is about, as I said, about 2400 BP, and that site has livestock associated with the earliest pottery. So again, one of the earliest dates for livestock in this region, only 2,500 years ago. But no preserved plant remains. We had 1 barley grain which was destroyed in AMS dating. So you can either say, well, it's intrusive, or it might really be that date. And so, so that's where we are. And those cave sites have very few macro remains, very few parenchyma fragments, very little stuff to work on. So our hope rests in looking at phytoliths, which are very well preserved in all these sites. So we have lots of phytoliths, that's clear. So they provide a basis for looking for a long-term plant view sequence and compare it across these sites. And so with that, I'm going to turn over to Cristina, who's going to talk about our current project and the phytolith side, where we are.
Okay, so you have the general idea of Ethiopia and the state of what the archaeology is in Ethiopia. I will go into the nitty-gritty of what I'm actually doing in the project. So the project is this one, Evolutionary Dynamics of Vegetative Agriculture in the Ethiopian highlands, and it's a collaborative project between UCL and Kew Gardens, which is also funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, and it ends in 2025. It's got 2 basic aims. One is to basically address the questions of evolutionary history of enset, which is, I guess, a proxy for vegetative agriculture, and how it was, how it's changed in its patterns in Ethiopia, whether it's a relationship it has to the sociocultural history or if it's ecological. Another aim is to take a look at the distribution of the enset crop and how it has evolved given the different environmental adaptations that it has, as well as whether it goes back in time and it has it was exploited in antiquity, and therefore our role here is to try and take a look at phytoliths to try and establish whether we can find enset in antiquity. So like I said, it's a collaborative project, so multidisciplinary, where we have our colleagues from Kew Gardens working on genomics or genetics, as well as ethnobotany. And in Addis Ababa, we also have ethnobotanists and archaeologists working there. In UCL, what we're trying to look at is the archaeobotany, but also try and conduct some work on the modern reference material to compare this to the archaeobotanical assemblage later on. We also have other collaborators which are found across the world. So like Luc Vidar, which is based in Belgium, and he's an archaeobotanist that works in Musaisi, particularly Musa. He's done a lot of work on Musa, or bananas. Then we've got Katharina Neumann in Germany, who has done a lot of archaeobotany in Ethiopia and is also waiting for us to come up with identification criteria that she can use on her material that she's got at the moment, so archaeobotanical material. And of course, Hildebrand and Brandt, who have worked extensively in the southwestern part of Ethiopia. So we are also looking at different time depths in our project. So the first part would be to look at present diversity in Ethiopia. For this, we have the genetics and the ethnobotany collaborators in Kew Gardens working on this, wherein they're trying to take a look at what the landrace diversity within different groups or communities in Ethiopia, and how these different landrace diversities in these particular groups are reflected by the cultural practices of these people, and whether there are any changes in these land races in these communities. The second is to look at the recent past. And for this, again, we have our collaborators in Kew Gardens who are doing ethnobotanical work, including a lot of interviews with these communities in order to take a look at what creates these centers of diversity in particular areas, whether it is a product of culture, whether it's a product of environment, because we know that enset grows in different altitudes, for example, or whether it's a product of antiquity. And finally, the deep time pass. So this is where the archaeology would come in. But in order to do that, before we look at the archaeology, we do need to have a set of rules of identification for the phytoliths. And as you have seen from what Dorian has just presented, there has been really hardly any evidence of enset in the archaeology so far. So what are we looking at exactly? We are trying to refine the enset phytolith identification, which we will pass on also to our collaborators in Germany. And to do this, I particularly want to be able to distinguish between whether we can differentiate phytoliths of enset between wild and domesticated, or within the cultivars as well. So the different land races according to age, ploidy, or altitudes. We are also wanting to take a look at how old enset cultivation is, and of course, we can only do this, like I said, if we have a set of criteria. So you've seen a lot of slides about enset, but what is enset? Okay, it's a herbaceous plant that comes from the Musaceae family. So the most well-known Musaceae crop, I would say, is banana. Most people have never heard of enset, unless you probably work in UCL, the Institute of Archaeology. It is a monocarpic plant which only flowers once and then it dies. The main difference between enset and banana is in what is eaten of this particular plant. So bananas, normally you'd think fruit, so people eat the fruit of the banana. In the case of enset, everything of the plant is used except for the fruits. So the flowers and the fruits are not actually used at all. In fact, you kill the plant before it even flowers. Once it flowers, it's rendered useless, so you don't really eat the plant anymore. Because the part of the plant that you eat is basically the pseudostem and the corm. So the leaves are useful as well and are commonly used for a lot of things, and I'll show you examples of how it's used. But there are three different ways of using enset for food. The first one would be amicho, which is the corm, and you will normally use a very, very young enset for amicho because the corm is considered better the younger it is. So once you use the amicho, you kill the plant and you no longer have the enset, right? Amicho is boiled a bit like any tuber, like a potato or taro. The next part of the plant that's used is the pseudostem together with the corm, wherein you scrap the pseudostem, which is basically the leaf, and the pseudostem is this, and you pulverize the corm in order to squeeze out the liquid. I'll show you a video if I can of how they process it. But they squeeze out the liquid, and the resulting liquid is then left to evaporate, and it's a very, very soft powder which you can use for pancakes, porridge, and it's considered, bula is considered like the top or the premium product from enset. And lastly, you can use it for kocho. So kocho also uses the pseudostem and the corm, but you ferment it for a period of time. It can be fermented for up to 6 months to 2 years, so it stores quite well, which is why they call it the plant against hunger or the tree against hunger, because you can store it for a long period of time and it can feed a family of people for maybe a week or even more. So here you've got examples of, this is kocho, which is normally turned into a kind of bread and eaten with kitfo, which is raw meat, I would say, raw meat. So it's, and this is the porridge, so the bula. And I still haven't found a good picture of amicho. So the other uses of enset which, like I said, they use the entire plant. So you can use it for wrapping. So you go to the market, and most of the produce in the markets are wrapped in enset leaf. You also use it for fiber or rope. So again, you walk around the villages, and enset is available everywhere. They use it for everything. They don't discard any part of it. The leaves are used for fodder. This is an enset pit. So what they've done is they've lined it with leaves of enset, and then once your cocho, or what you're going to make cocho with, is ready for fermentation, you put it in the pit, and then you put more leaves on top, you cover it, and you let it ferment for as long as, sometimes even more than 2 years. They also make beautiful baskets and mats with it, and as well as lining for roofs, for example. So it's also it's an extremely useful plant that they use constantly. You see it everywhere. And the processing of enset is something that is mainly a female role, so it's women who actually do the processing. And here you've got several images of how they do it. So this woman is scraping the pseudostem or the leaf sheath with it's a bamboo scraper. And then they're making bula here, so they're taking the liquid out. In here is the cocho. This is the bula, which will be dried, and it's very powdery. And here you've got, this is one of the few photos where you see a man actually doing something with the processing. And he is processing the corn. He's pounding it. The corn will eventually go into this bit here, which is squeezed, and the water is taken out. And then finally, the fermenting process. As you can see, it's a very big pit. Look at the size of the man compared to the pit. So they are huge pits, and you have to be careful when you walk around the orchard, so to speak, because you know it's full of pits everywhere. So you really have to be careful. So this is just a short video of a woman processing the enset. So they use fibers to line the baskets here, and then they put the enset that's been scraped inside. They attach it to the ensets, so they use the enset to process the enset. And then they take out the liquid, and that liquid will not go to waste. That's the bula. And again, the fiber, as you can see, which is made of enset. It's very, very labor intensive, I have to say. So that's it. And then they take out whatever is in here to put in the pit. Okay, so to establish a baseline, why are we doing phytoliths? Okay, so the best answer for this is if you know Musaceae at all as a plant, and you try to do archaeobotany and try to look for evidence of Musaceae, bananas for example, you will be hard pressed. Because at least in the case of bananas, it is a parthenocarpic fruit, which means it doesn't actually have or contain any seeds once it's domesticated. You will find them in the wild, but of course if you're interested in domesticated banana, you will not find it archaeologically. So another reason why we do phytoliths is also that the phytoliths of Musaceae are particularly diagnostic. They have this volcaniform. They look like little volcanoes with craters, and are very distinguishable from other phytoliths, both for banana and for enset. So here you've got an example of Musa phytoliths with their distinctive volcaniform shape. And I don't know if you are familiar with the claim that they found banana phytoliths in Cameroon, the famous Nkang Musa, and it dates to 2500 BP according to the authors of the paper. It is contentious because although there's no doubt that this is Musa, I think it's the right size for Musa and the right shape, we are not so sure about the dating of this. So because of that, we think that phytoliths are probably the best approach to try and look for enset archaeologically, because again, as you have seen, the processing of phytoliths, the processing of enset does not actually yield any seeds unless you're looking at wild enset. So one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is looking at variation in these phytoliths. How are they changing according to age, according to ploidy, or according to altitude? And in this particular project, I have the chance to actually work with one project, with one crop, which means I can really look at all these different variations in one crop. This can actually be something that can be used later on for other phytolith studies as well, because I don't think anyone's actually done the work of looking at one crop and looking at variation within one crop. So the first thing I did was try to establish the protocol of what I'll be doing, or the methods. So I tried to ash the phytoliths, or rather the modern reference material, which are leaves, to look for the phytoliths. And I didn't use HCl in the beginning, and then I used HCl later on to compare. So here we've got an example of the same leaf products, one with HCl and the other one without. And I've decided that using HCl to remove the carbonates is probably the best protocol, because you can actually see the phytoliths more clearly. Another thing was I used the SEM quite a lot at the beginning with the help of Russell, and it gives very good imaging, but the problem is it's very, very time consuming. And if I have to measure everything with the SEM, I don't think I'm actually using the property of UCL quite efficiently and effectively. So recently I got a ×100 oil immersion lens, which has actually been very, very helpful for the measurements. So decided that for type specimens, I can use the SEM, but for the measurements, it's better to use a high-powered microscope. Also the data points. I am looking at measuring around 50 to 100 data points per sample. That means length, width, crater diameter, and again, the number of individuals per group, each group being age, and I'm looking at ages from 1 to 11, as well as altitudes. So you see that enset grows in different altitudes, and that actually affects the growing behavior of the plant. So it's important to actually take a look at whether that is affecting the way the phytoliths eventually look, or the variation in the phytoliths. And then the last thing would be the ploidy. There are diploids and tetraploid and triploids. So that could potentially also affect the way the phytoliths look. So I'm trying to get a minimum of 5 individuals per group to try and compare across these different individuals. And also only measure articulated phytoliths. I've got the benefit of doing that because I'm using modern reference material. Once you start looking at things archaeologically, it all changes. But this is basically just to be able to help me later on with the archaeological material. So some of the work that I've done with the phytoliths from the same individuals, showing an enset, which is H4, we can see that there is huge variation. Just within one individual, we can already see that, yes, the length here is less than the length that you'd find in a different set of phytoliths. So that is actually a difficulty that I have to deal with, because I'm still trying to understand where this variation is coming from. In order to do this, I'm going to need to look at more H4 enset leaves, but that's work in progress. So in order to try and study this a little bit better, I have taken the liberty of sampling the enset plant from the temperate house in Kew Gardens, wherein I was allowed to actually take as many samples as I wanted. So what I did was I took samples from the enset. Here you've got an enset that's flowering. You would never really see this in Ethiopia, because if it flowers, then nobody wants to eat it anymore. So it's considered, they don't care for it. But this is the flower of the enset. It's a huge flower. It looks like an alien, actually. And so what I did was I sampled 3 different leaves, the second oldest, the second youngest, and one in the middle. And I did cross sections of the leaves, wherein I want to study whether there's a difference in the phytoliths in the tip versus the base, and those that are closer to the midrib, as opposed to those that are closer to the ends of the lamina. And I also sampled other parts of the enset plant. By the way, this one's dead now. They've replaced it with a younger one in Kew Gardens. So what you can see is that this is just an example of one of the samples that I took a look at, wherein there is variation in the leaf, but it seems to cluster still quite well between tip and base if of the same leaf. So maybe the variation is according to the different ages of the leaves as opposed to within a leaf. And in order to see this variation a little bit more accurately, I plan to conduct some histological work at Kew Gardens by making thin sections of particular type specimens and try to see if there are variations that are occurring, like I said, in the tip of the leaf versus the base, and why this variation is actually occurring. Because we know that phytoliths are probably there for structural reasons, but how is the structure changing according to age or temperatures or altitude? We don't really know that, and nobody does actually. So the next thing I'm interested in is looking at variation by age. When I'm talking about age, it's the age of the plant, not age of the leaf. So this is just a small example of different aged samples of enset. So ages 1 all the way to 11. I just did a regression line to take a look, and it does look like the length and the width ratio of phytoliths seems to increase with older aged ensets. And this is a bit messy, so you can't really see anything there. So what I did was I just compared the youngest ones to the oldest ones, and indeed there is variation. That's definitely happening. Again, we don't understand why, but it is something that I'm examining. This here is just to show you that, so this is the length width ratios. These are the ages. And the green part of the bar graph here shows any phytolith that is larger than 1.1 in the length width ratio. And they seem to cluster mostly in the older ensets. In the young ensets, we seem to have less phytoliths that are larger than 1.1 length width ratios. So the other thing that I'm looking at is the variation between wild and domesticated phytoliths, because obviously in order to come up with a history, evolutionary history of enset, we need to actually understand when domesticated enset is being used by these groups of people in the southwest of Ethiopia. We have been able to take samples of the wild ensets. You have an example of a wild enset growing in the forests of Sheka. And it's easily discernible that they're wild because they don't grow in clusters. They're quite separate, because the way they grow is not vegetatively, but through seeds. So you have monkeys that are taking eating the little bananas and then dispersing it around. However, when I took a look at the wild ensets, they basically look very, very similar to the domesticated young enset phytoliths. So this could cause potential problems if you're looking at samples and saying, oh, we've got wild phytoliths of wild enset. But in reality, it could be that they are just very young ensets. So it's something that, again, I have to bear in mind. So they do cluster. Finally, I've taken the liberty of getting more samples from enset plants, which include the bracts, the corm, and of course the seeds of enset. However, I don't know if I'll be able to conduct more work on this because time is limited, but we do have a large collection now of seed phytoliths from the Musaceae family, and I think I could try and differentiate from from each of the species to try and see which ones are enset and which ones aren't. Likewise, I've collected leaf samples from other Musaceae species from Kew Gardens, and I've started doing the work on that as well. One of the things is that we can say is that we can actually differentiate between Musa or banana and enset just based on the size. Musa phytoliths are larger than enset, which again, I think will complicate matters for archaeobotanists that want to look for enset in the phytolith samples, because they are really quite small. They're around less than 10 microns. And when you're looking at these in a high-powered microscope, you really do need to go to times 40 or times 100 to try and make sure that they are indeed enset phytoliths. So it's actually a very slow process of looking for these things. So this is the work that's being conducted by Philippa Ryan in Kew Gardens. She has been conducting a lot of ethnobotanical research by doing interviews with different communities and groups of farmers. And she interviews all these households from different altitudes and different cultural groups to try and understand what land races they're actually growing now, which ones they used to have in the past and are no longer growing now, and what attributes they have. So she asks questions that answer what uses they have for the enset, how many times they eat the enset, because obviously they are changing their eating habits with other types of crops coming in or other types of food. Whereas before maybe they used to eat more enset, now they eat less enset and they substitute it with other crops. And here's an example of how her interviews are posed, wherein she looks at temporal change from today. She normally interviews elders as well, so she gets a good background that span 30 years, if they can remember. So she asks whether they would eat caoutchouc now and how is that different from the past, or whether they use it for fiber now and compare it to the past. So that's something that she's collating right now. And finally, she has also been documenting some of the crop processing tools, such as these here. So the scraper, the knife that they use for cutting, and this is just the plant that they put the pseudostem on and then they scrape on. And just a very, very short note on the genetics. Our collaborators in Kew Gardens basically have done some work that has been published already, where they're actually looking, they're interpreting their work as domesticated enset having been a single domestication event or monophilic. I think there's some disagreement here, but that actually just really depends on how long ago the enset had been domesticated, which is why they need the archaeology to basically help them understand their work as well. On the other hand, because it's a clonal vegetative crop, they also see that it has a bottleneck effect where it reduces the genetic diversity, and that is quite normal for a clonal crop, because once you domesticate it, you just propagate the same one. But on the other hand, it has a higher somatic mutation accumulation. Again, something that is quite common with clonal crops. Anyway, this is a paper if you're interested in it. I just wanted to thank these people over here. Sandra, who's been fantastic at helping me, and Sue, who's been my ear. And that's it.